The year is 1789. The United States, 6 years after the American Revolution, finally ratifies the Constitution. Washington stands proud. Jefferson readies himself for the coming conflicts. Hamilton likely sings a song or two. But meanwhile, across an ocean, something else is brewing. A new wave of liberty was threatening to crash upon the European continent, one that would bring chaos and bloodshed, violence and beheadings. Revolution was coming to France, and it would not be pretty. Now, the French Revolution is an event in history that has captured my interest for a long time, and one that has had more impact upon the world than almost any other event in the 1700s, barring maybe the American Revolution. Now, in this speech, I hope to inform you of the winding road that France took in order to free itself from tyranny, and the many bumps it hit along the way. But first and foremost, history is a series of causes and effects. Before the events of 1789, King Louis XIV of France accrued massive debt participating in several wars, including pouring money into our own American Revolution. Now, his descendant, King Louis XVI, found himself unable to pay off all this debt that the French government was mounted with, and thus he was forced to call the Estates General, a meeting between the three social classes in France. The first estate, the church, the priests and whatnot; the second estate, society's wealthy; and the third estate, the remaining 98% of the population, the middle class, the peasantry. But each estate was given one vote in the Estates General, meaning that since the clergy and the wealthy often sided with each other, the third estate was often left with no say in anything. Upset at this fact, the Third Estate formed the National Assembly and refused to disperse from outside the Estates General building until they received constitutional reform. Now, the king reluctantly agreed, but the National Assembly was still rightfully afraid of military retaliation, and thus they stormed the large Bastille prison and armed themselves on July 14, 1789. After the king refused further demands for liberty and equality, the peasantry and the French people marched on the capital city of Versailles and arrested the king and queen right from their palace. King Louis XVI and his wife Marie Antoinette would never see their home in Versailles again. Now, after 1789, France took a sharp turn towards the radical, and a new government was formed. Now, the king would share his power with the new Legislative Assembly. Now, war soon broke out with neighboring nations because foreign kings worried that if the powerful French king could fall, so could we to our own people. Austria and Prussia began to close in on Paris, and the French people grew paranoid that, oh, maybe our king is committing treason. After all, his wife is Austrian, he could be helping the enemy. A new government was formed after that, called the National Convention, and their first order of business was to abolish the monarchy. On January 21st, 1793, the king was found guilty and was executed via guillotine. 9 months later, his wife Marie Antoinette would follow him. Now, the National Convention didn't want problems at home and abroad. So, under the command of Maximilien Robespierre, they began rounding up so-called enemies of the revolution. According to historian Marissa Linton of Kingston University, approximately 17,000 people were killed during what was called the Reign of Terror. Now, with their focus on the war, the National Convention was able to shake off Austria and Prussia and the newly joined Britain. Now, with no more war and no more emergency, eyes turned towards Robespierre. Much like he condemned many without any proof to the guillotine, on July 28, 1794, Robespierre was overthrown and sentenced to beheading. Now, a common trend in history is the pendulum effect. If a government becomes too powerful, it'll swing towards liberal reform, but oftentimes will swing back right to where we started. Now, to replace the National Convention, a new government would form. That's 3 now. The Directory. Now, the Directory was incredibly inefficient and insanely corrupt, but all of their backlash was squashed by the military, which was run by the new Napoleon Bonaparte. But in 1799, fed up with the Directory, Napoleon staged a coup and crowned himself the new Consul of France. Essentially, he was an emperor, rivaling the power of Louis XVI, the one we overthrew to start this whole mess. Now, Napoleon would dominate much of Europe during the 1800s, but that's a story for another day. Now, although it was brief, I'd like to look back and consider the long road we just went down. The revolution started much like our own American Revolution. The people were dissatisfied with the monarchy and thus began to rebel. This is where they diverged, because the French Revolution soon took a turn for the radical that culminated in the Reign of Terror. And after the dust cleared and the bloodshed ended, we found ourselves right back where we started. Napoleon was another powerful monarch that headed France. But in the modern day, the French Revolution has become a worldwide symbol of revolution in the face of tyranny, especially that guillotine. One revolution that shares this honor with the French Revolution is our own, the American Revolution. Just recently in Hong Kong, protesters could be seen waving the American flag and chanting about 1776, demanding democracy from the Chinese government. Now this poses the question upon you as an American. Are you the symbol the world views you as? Have you upheld your revolution the same way the French people have upheld theirs? King Louis XVI was a spoiled monarch that couldn't stop spending money and ignoring his own people. There are a lot of Louis out there, and it's all of our responsibility to make sure that people cut from his cloth never make it back to his seat of power. And if they do, there's always a guillotine on the horizon. Thank you for your time.